Reasonable domain and range notes. A local youth group is planning a trip to a local amusement park. They're taking their church bus, which holds up to 32 people. It will cost $25 for parking, and tickets to enter the park are $22.50 per person. The equation that models this situation is C of n equals 22.5n plus 25, where C represents the cost for the youth group to go to the park, and n represents the number of people who can go on this excursion. So we're going to identify if this is discrete or continuous, and then we're going to identify the reasonable domain and reasonable range. So based on this situation, we're given the equation. So when you're given the equation, you want to quickly identify what the domain and range are. So C of n is our function notation for y. So this is our range for this situation. And our range is discussing the cost. So range is the cost. It is the output. It is the dependent variable. The dependent variable is depending on how many people are going to go on this excursion. So then that brings us to n. N is like our x value, which is our input, our domain. So our domain here is going to represent n, which is the number of people going on this trip. So your domain are your people going, the number of people. So now let's go ahead and identify if the problem is discrete or continuous. So you ask yourself, can I half this data? If I cannot half the data, it is discrete. Or am I measuring something, because continuous data is something I can measure? Well, if I'm taking one person, 2, 3, all the way up to 32 people, I cannot half that, so it is discrete data. So when I identify that, I need to remember that discrete data, I'm going to list my values when I come up with my domain and range. Now to discuss reasonable domain. Well, reasonable domain is talking about n, the number of people going on this trip. So the reason we say reasonable domain is because we cannot have negative 2 people attend this trip. So we need to restrict our domain and focus on how many people can go on this trip and where should we begin? Well, we can begin with 1 person attending this trip. And then we can go to 2, 3, 4. And because this church bus can only hold up to 32 people, we are restricted at 32. So we would list all the values from 1, 2, 3, all the way to 32. But we're going to go ahead and just use these dots to indicate that. Now let's go ahead and come up with a reasonable range. Well, here the situation is discussing the cost to be the range. So the cost depends on the number of people going. The cost is dependent on the domain. So because our range depends on the cost, we need to take this equation and we need to plug in those values for x to identify what the reasonable range would be. So if I take the equation, C of n equals 22.5n plus 25, this is telling me 22.5 is the cost per person, plus 25 is the fee that they have to charge to park. So what we need to do is identify how much it would cost to take 1 person on this trip. So I'm going to plug in 1 for n into this equation to identify the cost. So when I plug in 1 for n, I'm using parentheses because 22.5n is 22.5 times n times 1. So when I take 1 person on this trip, it would be 22.5 times 1 plus 25, 47.5. And this would begin the cost if we took 1 person. So my range would begin at 47.5. We could plug in each value. We're just going to go ahead and plug it in and plug in the last value to 32. So now let's go ahead and find C of 32. So if I take 32 people on this trip, which is the max, how much would it cost? So let's go ahead and plug in 32 and multiply it with 22.5, and then we'll add 25, which is that fee for parking. So C of 32 equals 745. So that means my reasonable range would be from 47.5 all the way to 745. And we would list these values if we could, but in this case, we cannot list every single value here. So now you're going to go ahead and try this on your own.